The laughter in my living room was a sharp, brittle sound, like glass shattering. It was my daughter-in-law, Amelia's, laughter. She was hosting her monthly book club, a collection of women as sharp, as brittle, and as expensive as herself. I was sitting in my usual armchair in the corner, a half-finished knitted scarf in my lap, a quiet gray ghost in my own home. I had long ago learned that my presence at these gatherings was not requested, but tolerated, as long as I remained as silent and as inanimate as the old grandfather clock in the hall. One of her friends, a thin, nervous woman named Patricia, glanced over at me, her eyes wide with a kind of startled surprise, as if she had just noticed a piece of furniture she hadn't seen before. "One of her—" "My God, Amelia," she whispered, her voice a low, conspiratorial hiss. "Your mother-in-law is so quiet, I almost forgot she was even here." Amelia, who was in the middle of pouring a glass of expensive imported wine, let out a tinkling, cruel laugh. It was a sound designed to be heard, to be admired. "Oh, her?" she said, not even bothering to look in my direction. "Don't worry about her. She's not really here. She's just a ghost. A sad little ghost that haunts this chair. We just work around her." They all laughed then, a chorus of sharp, brittle, and deeply, deeply cruel laughter. And in that moment, in that beautiful sun-drenched living room, surrounded by the scent of expensive wine and the sound of their amusement at my expense, something inside me, something that had been slowly, quietly, and painfully withering for years, finally snapped. She wanted a ghost? Fine. I was about to give her one. A ghost who knew all the secrets of this house. A ghost who was tired of being quiet. A ghost who was about to turn her perfect, orderly, and beautiful life into a living, breathing, and deeply, deeply haunted nightmare. Hi everyone, I'm Grandma Clara. I'm 79 years old. And my daughter-in-law thinks I'm a ghost. She's about to find out how right she is. The secret I am sharing with you today is not about money, or about a crime, or about a long-lost inheritance. It is a story about a house. This house. A house that my late husband, Arthur, and I built together 50 years ago. Arthur was not an architect or an engineer. He was a magician. A professional illusionist. A man who spent his life creating secrets, building illusions, and mastering the art of misdirection. And this house was his greatest trick. To the outside world, it is just a beautiful, if slightly quirky, old Victorian home. But it is a house of secrets. A house of hidden passages, of two-way mirrors, of secret panels, of a state-of-the-art sound system, with speakers hidden in every room, all connected to a simple, custom-designed tablet my husband built for me before he died. A tablet that my daughter-in-law, a woman who sees all of his work as nothing more than childish, sentimental clutter, has allowed to sit so innocently on my bedside table. For 5 years, ever since I moved in with my son and his wife after Arthur's death, Amelia has been on a quiet, relentless campaign to erase me, to make me invisible, to turn me into the silent, harmless ghost she so cruelly joked about today. She has slowly, systematically taken over my home, my life, my very presence in my own family. She thought my silence was a sign of my weakness, of my defeat. She had no idea that my silence was a form of observation, a form of reconnaissance, a form of study. I have been watching her. I have been listening to her. And I have been waiting. And today, with her one cruel and breathtakingly arrogant joke, she has finally given me my cue. The show is about to begin, and my daughter-in-law, the star of our little production, has no idea that the ghost she created is also the director, the producer, and the writer of the terrifying psychological horror movie that is about to become her life. So please, get comfortable. This is a story about a woman who was told she was a ghost and who decided to embrace the role with a creativity and a vengeance that no one, least of all her tormentor, could have ever seen coming. Your support, your likes and subscriptions to Silent Grandma are the quiet, ghostly applause that will fuel my performance. To understand why I decided to haunt my own home, to wage a war of psychological terror against my own son's wife, you have to understand the years she spent trying to erase me. You have to understand the beautiful, magical world my husband built, and her relentless, joyless, and deeply, deeply insulting campaign to dismantle it. My life with Arthur was a fairy tale. Not a fairy tale of princes and castles, but a fairy tale of secrets and wonder and a deep and abiding love of illusion. Arthur was a professional magician. He was not famous, not a man who performed on grand stages in Las Vegas. He was a quiet, brilliant, and deeply respected creator of illusions for other, more famous magicians. His workshop, which was in the basement of this very house, was a place of wonder, a labyrinth of trapdoors and hidden compartments, and beautiful, intricate machines designed to deceive the eye and delight the soul. Our house was his canvas, his laboratory. It was a house that was alive with his magic. We had a bookcase in the library that was also a secret door. We had a series of hidden, state-of-the-art speakers, a system he called the voice of God, that could make a whisper sound like it was coming from inside your own head. We had a two-way mirror in his study, a relic from an old stage show that allowed him to observe a room without being seen. Our life was a constant, joyful game of what is real and what is illusion. We raised our son, David, in this world of wonder. But David, my dear, sweet and deeply, deeply literal son, had no patience for his father's magic. He was a boy of facts and figures, a boy who saw the world not as a place of wonder, but as a problem to be solved. He became a successful and very serious financial analyst. He loved his father, but he saw his father's life's work as a source of mild, and often public, embarrassment. He saw his magic as childish, as silly, as a frivolous waste of time. And then he married a woman who was his perfect and utterly joyless match, Amelia Dewan. Amelia was a woman who did not just dislike my husband's magic, she was offended by it. She was a ruthless pragmatist, a woman who saw the world in black and white, a woman who saw our house not as a place of wonder, but as a collection of outdated and deeply, deeply embarrassing eccentricities. After Arthur died 5 years ago, my world became a quiet, gray, and deeply lonely place. And David and Amelia, their faces masks of loving concern, insisted that they move in with me. "You shouldn't be alone, Mom," David had said. "We'll take care of you." And so began Amelia's great war against my husband's memory, her relentless, systematic, and deeply, deeply cruel campaign to erase every last trace of his magic and of me from this house. The first casualty was his workshop, his beautiful, chaotic, and wonderful workshop in the basement. She called it a fire hazard. She called it a collection of junk. She hired a team of men who, in a single brutal afternoon, dismantled 40 years of his life's work and hauled it away in a dumpster. His beautiful, intricate machines, his books of secrets, his tools, his memories, all of it gone. I had stood at the top of the basement stairs, and I had watched them do it, my heart a cold, dead stone in my chest. David, of course, had been at work. The second casualty was the house itself. She began a campaign of modernization, a joyless, systematic, and deeply insulting process of stripping the house of its soul. The beautiful, hand-carved, and secretly unbalanced mantelpiece Arthur had built was torn out and replaced with a sleek, minimalist, and utterly soulless slab of concrete. The comfortable, worn-out armchairs in the living room were replaced by a set of hard, angular, and deeply uncomfortable leather cubes. The warm, buttery yellow of the kitchen walls was painted over with a cold, sterile, and deeply, deeply depressing shade of gray. And with every change, a piece of my husband and a piece of me was erased. The final and most brutal casualty was me. She began a quiet and deeply effective campaign to render me invisible. She would talk over me at the dinner table. She would ignore my questions. She would treat my stories, my memories as the ramblings of a senile old woman. She would have conversations with my son as if I were not even in the room. And she gave me a new name. The Ghost. It started as a cruel joke between her and her friends, the brittle, sharp-tongued women from her book club. "Don't mind Clara," she would say with a tinkling, false laugh. "She's just the house ghost. She just floats around." And my son, my weak, conflict-averse, and deeply, deeply cowardly son, would just smile, a tight, uncomfortable smile, and say nothing. He let her do it. He let her erase me. He let her turn me into a ghost in my own home. For years, I had endured it. I had retreated into myself, into a world of quiet, lonely, and deeply, deeply heartbroken silence. I became the ghost she wanted me to be. A quiet, harmless, and utterly invisible old woman, haunting the corner of my own living room. I did it to keep the peace. I did it because I did not have the strength to fight back. I did not have the will. But today was different. Today, she had made a mistake. She had said the quiet part out loud. She had not just called me a ghost to her friends. She had looked at me, at my silent, invisible form, and she had declared that I would not be missed. And in that moment, she had not just insulted me. She had resurrected me. She had resurrected the woman who had married a magician, the woman who knew all of his secrets, the woman who knew that the greatest magic of all is the art of misdirection. She thought she was looking at a ghost. She had no idea she was looking at the new, and deeply, deeply motivated, master of the illusion. My show, was about to begin. My first haunting was a simple one. A test of the system. A quiet and deeply, deeply satisfying little experiment in the art of psychological warfare. That night, after the book club harpies had finally departed, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume and the lingering bitter taste of their cruelty, I waited. I waited until the house was dark, until the silence was a thick, heavy blanket. I waited until I heard the soft, rhythmic breathing of my son, Mark, from his downstairs bedroom, and the restless, agitated tossing and turning of Amelia in the master suite upstairs, the room that had once been mine and Arthur's. And then, from my command center and my little armchair, I went to work. I picked up the tablet my husband had made for me. The screen glowed to life, illuminating my face in the darkness. The interface was a thing of beauty, a simple, elegant map of the house. Every room was a small, touch-sensitive icon. I pressed the icon for the master bedroom. A new menu appeared. Lights. Sound. Temperature. I selected Soundin'. A library of audio files appeared, a library of my husband's life's work. Recordings of birdsong, of thunderstorms, of the ocean. And a special folder, labeled simply, Her. It was a library of me. My laughter. My humming. My voice, reading stories, telling jokes, whispering secrets. I chose a sound that was simple, subtle, and deeply, deeply personal. A recording of me, from years ago, whispering my husband's name. Arthur, just that. A single word, spoken in a soft, questioning, and deeply intimate whisper. I set the volume to a barely audible level, a ghost of a sound. And then, with a single silent tap of my finger, I played the sound. Just once. The effect was instantaneous. And it was glorious. I heard the sharp, sudden cessation of her restless tossing. I heard a gasp, a small, choked sound of pure, unadulterated shock. I could picture her, sitting bolt upright in her bed, her heart hammering against her ribs, her eyes wide in the darkness, straining to hear, to understand. She did not scream. She did not wake my son. She just sat there, in the darkness, for a long, long time, listening. And I knew, with a certainty that was a warm and deeply satisfying balm to my old withered soul, that she had heard it. She had heard the ghost. The next morning, she was a changed woman. The bright, brittle, and effortlessly cruel confidence was gone. In its place was a pale and deeply, deeply unattractive shade of fear. Her eyes were dark, bruised-looking. Her hand trembled as she poured her coffee. She kept glancing over her shoulder at the empty corners of the room, as if she expected to see me standing there, a shimmering, spectral apparition. My son, of course, was oblivious. "You look tired, honey," he said, his voice full of a genuine and deeply, deeply misplaced concern. "I'm fine," she snapped, her voice a little too sharp, a little too high. "Just a bad dream." She did not mention the whisper. Of course, she did not. How could she? How could she explain to her logical, rational, and deeply, deeply unimaginative husband that she had heard his dead mother, a woman who was, at that very moment, sitting silently in her armchair in the corner of the living room, whispering his dead father's name in her bedroom in the middle of the night? It was impossible. It was insane. It was the kind of thing that would make a person sound, well, crazy. And so, she said nothing. She suffered in silence. And I, from my throne in the corner, watched her. And I smiled. A small, secret, and deeply, deeply satisfying ghost of a smile. The first shot in the war for her sanity had been fired. And it had been a direct hit. My hauntings became a daily and deeply creative affair. I was a phantom, a poltergeist, a quiet and deeply, deeply malevolent artist of fear. I began to use the house itself as my canvas, my husband's magic as my paintbrush. I would use the hidden speakers to create small and deeply unsettling sounds. The soft, almost imperceptible creak of a floorboard in an empty room. The faint, ghostly tinkle of a wind chime on a windless night. The sound of a book falling from a shelf in the library when she was the only one home. And then I began to use the mirrors. My husband's beautiful and deeply, deeply deceptive two-way mirrors. There was one in the hallway, at the top of the stairs, a large, ornate, antique mirror that Amelia was particularly proud of. She thought it was a priceless heirloom. She had no idea it was a trick. A piece of stage magic my husband had salvaged from an old theater. From my small hidden observation post in the linen closet behind it, a post I could access through a secret panel in my own bedroom closet, I could see her without being seen. I began to make my appearances. I would wait until she was walking down the hallway, her back to the mirror. And then, for a single, fleeting, and deeply, deeply terrifying second, I would step into the frame. Just a flicker. A ghostly, gray-haired old woman in a faded floral dress, standing silently behind her, her face a mask of calm, quiet, and deeply, deeply unsettling sorrow. The first time she saw me, she did not scream. She just stopped, her body rigid, her hand flying to her throat. She spun around, her eyes wide with a wild and deeply gratifying terror. But of course, there was nothing there. Just an empty hallway. She stared at her own, pale, terrified reflection in the mirror, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She was a woman who was beginning to question her own eyes, her own mind, her own sanity. I did it again and again. A fleeting glimpse of me in the reflection of a window as she was washing the dishes. A shadowy figure behind her in the polished surface of the black granite countertop. Dying. I was everywhere, and I was nowhere. I was the ghost in her house. The ghost in her head. Her perfect, orderly, and beautiful life began to unravel. She became a prisoner in her own home, a house that was no longer a sanctuary, but a torture chamber. She was a woman at war with an enemy she could not see, could not fight, could not even prove existed. And her fear, her rage, her desperation, it all began to curdle into a thick and deeply, deeply poisonous paranoia. A paranoia that had only one logical and deeply satisfying target. My son, her husband. Their arguments, which had once been quiet, civilized, and deeply, deeply passive-aggressive affairs, became loud, ugly, and vicious. "You have to believe me, David," she would shriek, her voice a raw, ragged thing. I'm not crazy. I see her. I see your mother. She's here. She's everywhere. Amelia, for God's sake, he would say, his voice a low, weary, and deeply, deeply patronizing sigh. Mom is sitting in her chair in the living room. She hasn't moved in 3 hours. She's a sick old woman. She's not a ghost. You're lying, she would scream, her eyes wild with a desperate and deeply, deeply gratifying fury. You're in on it. You're helping her. You're both trying to drive me mad. He was not helping me, of course. He was just a man who was utterly and completely out of his depth. A man who was watching his beautiful, perfect, and always in control wife descend into a madness he could not comprehend. And he was terrified, not of the ghost, but of her. The final and most beautiful act of this phase of my haunting was not a sound or a whisper. It was a performance. I waited for a night when I knew they would be having one of their arguments, a night when her nerves were at their most raw, her mind at its most fragile. And as they stood in the living room, their voices rising in a crescendo of anger and of fear, I began my masterpiece. I used the intercom system to create a soundscape, a symphony of my own, ghostly presence. I started with a whisper, my voice, from the speaker in the hallway. Mark, a soft, questioning sound. Then the sound of a teacup clinking from the kitchen. Then a soft, humming sound, my humming, from the speaker in the dining room. Amelia froze, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She looked at her husband, her eyes pleading, desperate. You hear that, don't you? She whispered. You have to hear that. He heard it, of course. He was not deaf, but he could not, would not, allow himself to believe it. It's the pipes, Amelia, he said, his voice a weak and deeply, deeply pathetic lie. It's an old house. It makes noises. And then I delivered the coup de grace. I used the main and most powerful speaker in the system, the one that was hidden in the ceiling of the living room, right above their heads. And I whispered a single, simple, and deeply, deeply satisfying sentence. A sentence that was not a question, or a threat, or a plea. It was a statement of fact, a statement of my own, resurrected and deeply, deeply vengeful existence. I whispered, I'm right here. The silence that followed my final, whispered pronouncement was the most profound silence I have ever known. It was the silence of a world ending, the silence of a mind finally and irrevocably breaking. Amelia did not scream. She did not weep. She just stared into the empty space where my voice had been, her eyes wide, vacant, and utterly, utterly lost. She was a ship that had lost its rudder, its sails, its anchor, adrift on a sea of her own madness. My son David stood in the doorway, a statue carved from grief and disbelief. He looked at his wife, at the shattered, babbling wreck she had become, and he looked at the empty armchair in the corner of the room, the chair where I was supposed to be. And in his eyes, I saw the dawning of a terrible and deeply, deeply necessary understanding. The ghost his wife had been raving about was not a figment of her imagination. It was real. And it was his mother. He did not call the police. He did not call a doctor. He called me. His voice, when he finally spoke into the silence of the house, was a raw, broken whisper. Mom, where are you? Please, please, come out. I did not answer. The ghost was not yet done with her performance. The days that followed were a quiet and deeply, deeply satisfying purgatory for Amelia Dodge. David, in a state of shock and a dawning, terrible guilt, had her committed to a private and very expensive psychiatric hospital. A beautiful, serene, and deeply, deeply ironic place with white walls and quiet rooms, and a staff of calm, professional, and deeply, deeply skeptical doctors. She told them her story. She told them about the ghost of her mother-in-law, about the whispers in the walls, about the disembodied sounds, about the voice that had haunted her, until she could no longer tell the difference between what was real and what was not. They listened, of course. They nodded, their faces masks of professional sympathy. And they diagnosed her with acute psychosis, with a severe guilt-induced delusional disorder. They told my son, with a sad, pitying shake of their heads, that his wife had, under the stress of her own secret guilt over her treatment of me, created a ghost to punish herself. The ghost, they said, was a manifestation of her own broken mind. And I, from my quiet, comfortable armchair, listened to it all. The intercom system, my husband's brilliant and deeply, deeply satisfying invention, worked both ways. I could not only project my voice into any room in the house, I could listen. I listened as she was diagnosed, as she was medicated, as she was slowly and systematically erased, not by a ghost, but by the cold, hard, and deeply, deeply unsympathetic logic of modern psychiatry. She had tried to turn me into a ghost, and in the end, she had become one herself. A ghost in a white room, a ghost whose story no one would ever believe. I finally revealed myself to my son a week later. He came home from the hospital, his face a gray, haggard mask of grief and of guilt, and he found me sitting in my armchair, my knitting in my lap, as if I had never been gone. He did not speak. He just fell to his knees, and he laid his head in my lap, and he wept. He wept for his wife, for his life, for the mother he had so carelessly, so cruelly, and so completely abandoned. And I, in my silence, stroked his hair. The war was over, and I had won. Amelia never came back to the house. She was eventually transferred to a long-term care facility, a quiet and deeply, deeply expensive place where she would spend the rest of her days, a ghost in a world that no longer believed in her. My son divorced her, of course. The marriage, like the house, had been built on a foundation of lies, and it could not stand. My life, in the years that followed, was a quiet and a deeply, deeply peaceful affair. My son, Mark, moved back into the house. He was a broken man, a man who had lost everything. But in the wreckage of his life, he found something new. He found his father. He found the magic of connection. He began to spend his evenings with me, not out of a sense of duty or of guilt, but out of a genuine and a deeply, deeply moving desire to connect. He found the old dusty control panel for the intercom system in my closet, and he cleaned it, he polished it, he learned how it worked. And we began to talk. He would sit in the kitchen, and I would sit in my armchair, and we would talk for hours, our voices a quiet and a loving and a deeply, deeply healing presence in the house. He would tell me about his day. I would tell him stories about his father, about his childhood, about the life we had once had. The wire, my husband's beautiful and deeply, deeply loving invention, was alive again, and so was our family. So what is the final lesson from my long, dark, and deeply satisfying haunting? It is that a ghost is not a thing of chains and moans. A ghost is a memory that has not been laid to rest. A ghost is a story that has not been told. A ghost is a love that has been denied. And sometimes, the only way to lay a ghost to rest is to become one yourself. I also learned that the greatest magic of all is not the art of illusion, but the art of listening, of seeing, of paying attention. My daughter-in-law's greatest crime was not her cruelty, but her blindness. She looked at me, and she saw not a person, but a problem. She saw not a life, but an inconvenience. She saw not a mother, but a ghost. And in her blindness, she created the very thing she was so terrified of. My life is quiet now. It is a house of magic, a house of love, a house of a quiet and a deep and a deeply, deeply satisfying kind of peace. The ghost of Grandma Clara is gone. And in her place is just Clara, a woman who has, finally, been seen. A woman who has, finally, been heard. A woman who has, finally, come home. Thank you for joining me on this journey. It has been a story of great darkness, but also of a surprising and a deeply, deeply satisfying kind of light. Your support has been a constant source of strength. If my story has moved you, or made you believe in the magic of a quiet and a deeply, deeply underestimated old woman alike, or a subscription to Silent Grandma, would be a profound honor. Remember that you are not invisible. You are not a ghost. You are a story, and your story deserves to be heard. Be well, and be seen. I'll see you in that story. Love, you, Grandma Clara.